This morning, a potential game changer in the housing market. President Trump says he wants to slam the door on Wall Street investors buying single-family homes.
There's no misinterpretation. Ban of purchases from institutional investors or foreign investors on single-family home units. Only citizens, local permanent residents, can buy homes with very strict verifications.
Announcing plans to ban institutional investors from snatching up real estate and driving up housing prices, saying for a very long time, buying and owning a home was considered the pinnacle of the American dream. That American dream is increasingly out of reach for far too many people.
Start with the homeowners.
Okay, here's how you explain it. Wall Street started bundling home loans together, mortgage-backed securities, and selling slices of those bundles to investors. And they were making big money. So they started pushing the lenders, saying, come on, we need more loans.
The lenders had already given loans to borrowers with good credit, so they go bottom feeding, they lower their criteria.
Before, you needed a credit score of 620 and a down payment of 20%. Now they'll settle for $500, no money down.
And the buyer, the regular guy on the street, assumes that the experts know what they're doing. He's saying to himself, if the bank's willing to loan me money, I must be able to afford it. So he reaches for the American dream. He buys that house.
President Trump dropped a $200 billion bombshell on Friday when he directed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two big government-sponsored enterprises, to buy $200 billion of mortgage-backed securities in a bid to make housing more affordable by lowering interest rates.
Wall Street said to be blindsided by Trump's move. Companies like Blackstone and other major landlords seeing their stock prices drop. Trump pushing Congress to approve the ban, saying people live in homes, not corporations.
You have a lot of people have housing that because we have such a strong time and such a strong market, their houses are very valuable. It's a big part of their net worth, their house. I don't want to knock those numbers down.
But here's the problem. We can go back to 2020 and we can see that the Fed owned almost 30% of all mortgage-backed securities and had a negligible effect on interest rates.
Banks knew securities based on shitbag mortgages were risky.
You'll work on shitbag.
So to control their downside, the banks started buying a kind of insurance. If mortgages default, the insurance company pays.
At the same time, I want to make it possible for young people out there and other people to buy housing. In a way, they're at conflict. In other words, you create a lot of housing all of a sudden and it drives the housing prices down. So I want to take care of the people that have houses that have a value to the house that they never thought possible.
Affordability for first-time home buyers. The median price of an existing home in the U.S. now tops $400,000 with mortgage rates near 6%. But critics say large investors own just 1 to 3% of single-family homes. And they say Trump's proposal does not address other big issues.
Let's start with talking about the housing crisis in the United States of America. This is not a housing crisis, it's more of a control crisis. Because when people can't afford to buy homes, it's because someone else was allowed to outbid them with cheaper money. And right now, there is a quiet war going on, underway, over one question. Who is actually allowed to own your home in the UK, in America, in Europe? Not who lives in them, but who actually controls them. And if you think this is just a supply and demand story, then you're missing the secret, silent war entirely. If you work, if you save, and you still can't buy shelter, who is the system really actually built for? So let's name the mechanism of this beast immediately. No politics, no slogans, no party systems. The real beast is cheap credit plus institutional balance sheets, which equals housing financialization. Since 2020 alone, home prices have risen 40 to 45% nationally. And in Europe, it's even higher. Real interest rates have been deeply negative. Cheap money has been treated as permanent. For so long, homes have stopped becoming shelter. They've become duration-sensitive assets. Rental streams, discounted by policy, leveraged by institutions. Households were never meant to compete in that market. How are families actually supposed to compete with entities that borrow cheaper than they can ever imagine to borrow? This is why it matters that Donald Trump is now saying that something would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. He's saying that large institutional investors should actually be blocked from buying single-family homes. Not nudged, not taxed differently, but actually prohibited and blocked legally. Politicians don't readily say those kinds of things unless the denial has completely failed, because Trump didn't create this problem, but he's responding to a system that actually stopped working for normal people a long time ago. If banning institutions sounds extreme, why did letting them feel normal last for so long? People always want a villain. Markets always want a story, always want a narrative. They say names like BlackRock, but this isn't about just one entity. It's not just about one logo. Nationally, institutions own only 1 to 3% of single-family homes. Now, that sounds small until you realize ownership is very, very concentrated. It's not evenly spread out. In some cities, for example, institutions make up 20 to 30% of purchases in single years sometimes. That's not participation, that is domination, that's influence. If one buyer group can set the prices locally, is that actually truly still a free market? Because this is actually about policy and not so much greed, however counterintuitive that seems. Here's the truth that no one actually wants to say out loud. Institutions didn't steal the housing. Policy, government policy, local government policy actually handed it to them. Over a decade, rates were suppressed, yield was hunted actively, savers were punished with feverish aggression. Leverage was always rewarded. Because when cash guarantees loss, capital has to move. Housing was the obvious destination. This wasn't just a normal moral failure. It was incentive obedience. It was following the capital flows. It was following the policy decisions aggressively. Because if policy rewards leverage and punishes, let's say, saving or people who are prudential in terms of their retirement and their future, then who is it actually designed to enrich? The policy isn't designed to enrich the normal conservative saver. It's designed to enrich the people who take the most risk. And that's why we have to talk about the plumbing of the policy. Let's slow it down a little bit and let's talk about how the steps actually happen. Because step one is always that the real rates, after inflation, go negative. Then the cash becomes a liability, then institutions borrow, and then they buy the assets with the cheaper money. And households ask, how can I actually ever afford this? Because the flywheel is so much in the institution's favor. And the institutions ask, does this clear the hurdle rate? That's all they care about. That difference decides the actual ownership. Is housing still about living in that paradigm? Or is it about just a return on an investment? Were homes ever actually meant to be returns on investments? Or were they meant to be pure shelter plays? You hear the detractors and the defenders say, institutions don't own that much. You said it yourself, 1 to 3%. But averages don't break markets. Margins do. If institutions dominate starter homes in key metropolitan districts and cities and countries, they set price floors, they reset the rents, and they change the expectation mechanisms. That's why people feel hunted, because locally they actually are. If your city feels unaffordable, does the national average really matter to you? Averages are famously and notoriously tricky to use, but on average, there is a feeling of discontentment. Mortgage payments are near cycle highs. Rent stopped being an escape mechanism. When shelter becomes unreachable for the workers, the legitimacy of the government and the status quo of the day actually collapses. Politics always follows legitimacy failures. Trump isn't leading this revolt. He's just reacting to it. And in some ways, he's probably capitalizing upon it. What happens to your country, your nation, your city when working people can't afford to actually live in it? Does that actually provide a sturdy foundational framework for the future? Because there's an inherent contradiction. There's an inherent trap in all of this. You can block institutions, yes. You can legislate them out of existence. You can push them out of the market in a regulatory fashion. But if the credit stays loose, the prices won't fall. If supply is tight, demand remains. Mortgage markets stay supported forever. So the asset stays bid. Different owner, but the same price. Populism meets the plumbing. You can think of it like that. If prices don't actually fall, who actually benefits from that so-called reform? In that scenario, who actually really wins? If institutions are restricted tomorrow, who wins first? Existing homeowners, banks, developers? It's never the renters. it's not going to be the first-time buyers. That's why the reform is bound to always stall, because every layer of the system ends up protecting itself. If reform never ever helps new buyers, is it reform or is it protection of the status quo, of the current incumbents who benefit from being closest to the monetary financial spigot? This isn't Trump versus BlackRock. That's just branding. That's just media optics. That's just narrative. This is households versus a financialised sector. Homes as places to live versus something else. Homes as balance sheet instruments. Every time liquidity is chosen over affordability, this war obviously escalates. It does so quietly, relentlessly. And why has shelter stopped being a right and start being a collateral mechanism? Housing should have never been financialized, but in the hyper-financialized system that we live in, the collateral asset and the rental cash flows is more important than the shelter dynamic which homes ordinarily encompassed. So when you hear Wall Street is being challenged, ask only one question. Is the credit engine changing, or is it just a headline mechanism? Because housing didn't break by accident. It broke because it was absorbed into a system designed to protect the balance sheets and not the households. And once the shelter becomes collateral, it doesn't quietly revert back to the normal. This war won't use tanks. It's going to use something else, and something far more pernicious and insidious. It uses rate decisions, credit spreads, things like that are highly deceptive and highly quiet. It's very surreptitious. Liquidity programs, bidding algorithms, certain localized systems that benefit from the illiquidity of the housing sector and from cheap capital. And no matter who wins that political fight, ownership will always decide one thing: who gets the cheap money next. If money decides who owns your home, how free is that market actually really in reality? Well, I'd argue that it's not really free whatsoever. So, Trump versus households, Trump versus BlackRock, Trump versus the home-owning institutions. That's the narrative. But the truth is, who owns the liquidity and who has access to the cheapest capital? Because in the war against households, that's all that matters. Are you going to be able to afford that property, or is a large conglomerate going to buy them all up before you get the chance to, because they can outdo you on the cost of capital? My name's Justin Banton. This is the House of Trade. Ciao.